Hi YouTube, this is my third try. The batteries have been getting too hot in my GoPro. The memory stick held 32 minutes and I thought that was going to be long enough and it wasn't, so I had to get another memory stick and it only had 22 minutes, and so I had to go in and delete some files because I couldn't find our other little SD cards. Anyway, now everything's good. I should have an hour and I got 99% on my battery, so it should be good. So, I was out in the chicken yard. Here's this little story. This is my pinky finger. Right down there, I got a little pinky toe. Pinky Calhoun is in my story. And tiny baby mice are called pink. Maybe there's brand new baby mice. I don't guess they would have to be tiny. Are called pinkies because they're all pink. And there are people who raise pinkies to feed to other animals. But I was out in the chicken house, and we've recently put our juveniles in with our grown-up chickens, so all 20 of them are in the same pen now. And I had a plastic tub for the babies to hide in when the big chickens were getting to them. But now they just wander around squawking and balking, and it's okay because they're not hurting each other. It's just establishing the pecking order. But I moved that tub because I was cleaning out all the stuff from the baby chickens so that all the chickens would have more room. And when I moved the tub, there was a mouse nest under it, and in the mouse nest was like 7 or 8 pinkies. I don't know for sure how many because the chickens saw them about the same time I did. And chickens are carnivores, omnivores actually. Enough said. Oh, it's yucky. So we have Pinky Calhoun. I know it doesn't look pink at all. This is how I add it. This is Pinky Calhoun, chapter 17, episode 21. Wells and windlasses. The garden was planted and vegetables were growing. I watered it every morning and every evening from our well. I wondered if it'd be easier just to walk around dripping sweat on the garden instead of carrying a bucket after bucket of water. Mr. Harkin helped Elmer build a windlass. A windlass is like a cyclone. It's just another word for the same thing. Maybe what wiped us out was a twister, and maybe it was a cyclone. Maybe we got water from the windlass, or maybe we got it from the well. I called the whole thing the well. Elmer and Mr. Harkin built that crank contraption that they called a windlass to make it easier for me to water the garden all by myself. Before that, Elmer had to pull up the buckets of water by hand. I spent hours watering that garden, 1 bucketful at a time. Bossy still hung out where the old barn had been. Elmer milked her into our new bucket once. Then he took one of my little gold hearts and went to town and bought another bucket. So we would have 1 bucket for the well and 1 bucket for the milking. He decided to teach me how to milk the cow. My hands hurt so bad when I milked her for the first time. It took an hour. I had to quit before I got done. Elmer kept going after fresh grass for Bossy to eat. As long as she had food, she stood still. It usually took him about 20 minutes to milk the cow. If he hurried, he could get it done quicker than that. It seemed like everything he did made it so I could do more of his chores. He bought an axe, but he hadn't used it for anything but chopping wood when I needed to cook a meal. I wondered when he planned to teach me to chop wood. One night, long after we'd gone to sleep, a noise woke me up. I poked Elmer. He patted me to let me know he had heard it too. He motioned for me to take Annie and go deeper into the cave. I just couldn't do that. I pulled on my boots and I laced them up tight in case I needed to run. I walked to the edge of the darkness. The moon shone into the mouth of the root cellar. I stood back in the shadows, so if someone was out there, they couldn't see me. But I could taste Elmer's anger. I was burning holes in my back. I walked back to him and I whispered, if whoever or whatever is out there kills one of us, who's going to be better to watch, Annie? You or me? You, that's who. He just sat there with his mouth hanging open. I nearly screamed when a horse stuck its head in the doorway. It snuffled at me, and I recognized Patches. I almost called out to Pa and Ma before I realized Pa and Ma might not have been the ones who rode Patches here. I stayed in the darkness, edging along to see out better. Patches kept getting in my way. I slid next to him, standing in his shadow. I grabbed the saddle horn with both hands and put one foot in the stirrup. I didn't swing up into the saddle, though. I squatted on his side. I kicked him a little with my free foot, and he walked off. He walked up to some other horses that I didn't recognize. They weren't tied up, so I looped each set of reins over the saddle horn of another horse. 7 horses in all. I tried to stay in the middle of them, so if anyone looked, they wouldn't see me. I stared down the road toward town. In the moonlight, I could see someone walking toward us. It might have been Ma. I couldn't tell for sure. It looked like a woman in a dress, but it might have been a man wearing a duster. I didn't see Pa, though. That made me worry. Maybe someone tracked the horses to us. I didn't know if Pa had found Ma. I didn't even know if either one of them were still alive. My tummy had been tied in knots ever since Pa left and told me to do my best. The best I could imagine at this point was not dying. I looped the last set of reins around the first horse's saddle horn. Now they were all in a circle. If nothing else, they weren't going to run off fast. I went back inside and whispered all my stuff to Elmer. I took the baby and went deep into the cave as I could get. He came with me and sat down with his arm around me. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on Pa's lap with my head asleep on his chest. I could hear his heart going thump, thump, thump. Elmer sat between Ma and Pa, and Ma had Annabelle draped across her legs. Somehow, Fatty and Buddy had showed up. I'd never seen them in the cave before. I looked up at Pa's face. He stared at the ceiling, and tears dripped on me. Pa, we did our best. I wiped his tears with my apron. His shirt was torn and filthy. It had more holes in it than it did shirt. He had been gone a long time with no spare clothes. You are amazing. He squeezed me tighter and patted Elmer, who snored softly. Simply amazing. Whose horses are outside? Ours. My eyes popped wide open. Ours? We had never owned more than 4 horses at one time. This felt better than a dozen Christmases. Technically, they belonged to Mr. Gates's granddaughter, Annabelle Lee Calhoun, also known as Agatha Minerva Gates. Annie owns horses? She can't even say horsey. Does she own the saddles too? Ma patted my leg. Let Pa get some rest. He hadn't slept but a few hours since he left here. But if Annie owns the horses, does that mean Rufus and Mr. Gates are dead? Ma made an awful sound, but she agreed. Yes, they are dead. Now, will you please go back to sleep? Who killed them? Pinky. Ma and Pa chorused my name together. Sorry. I snuggled closer to Pa. I smiled. I knew I should feel bad that Rufus and his pa were dead, but I couldn't. The world was a better place without them. I had a new sister, and for the very first time I began to believe we might get to keep her. Billy Joe would always be in her life, but we would be her family. Does Letha know they're dead? They aren't even cold yet. Ma's answer shut me up. Oh. I closed my eyes and focused on sitting as still as I possibly could. Pa and Ma might never tell us what they went through, but they went through it together and came out together on the other side. For now, that was enough for me. When I woke up, Elmer and I had Annie snuggled between us on that bench, just like every night since the Twisters came. I went outside to greet the day and to hug Pa and Ma, and I couldn't find the horses. The dirt that was between the house and the barn and the chicken house that were gone had Elmer's footprints in it, and it had my footprints in it, but no horse tracks. But Pa and Ma hadn't left any tracks there either. I couldn't believe I had dreamed the whole thing. But it had all been a dream. I didn't plan to sit down, but all of a sudden I was on the ground on my hind end. No footprints but mine and Elmer's, and a few from Bossy. My tears fell onto my dress. Elmer found me sitting there. He didn't understand how much I needed Pa and Ma. I went out and started gathering grass. I gathered dozens of armloads of grass and stacked them in the root cellar. What Bossy didn't eat, we could sleep on. It would be softer than the dirt. Ma would have done it for us, but she wasn't here. More and more of her work piled up on my shoulders. I filled the box Elmer had made to feed Bossy. She wouldn't head this way until she heard the milk bucket rattle. All day long, I kept carrying Annie and carrying grass into the root cellar that we'd turned into our new home. Elmer didn't understand why I cried. All day long I cried. Day after day, no matter what I did, I cried. Tears ran down my face while I milked Bossy. I still hadn't gotten as fast as Elmer, but I learned not to complain. We had a cow, the baby had food, and so did we. I couldn't help but cry. I cut more grass for us to sleep on. If I got enough of it stored, Bossy would eat it and live through the winter. Mr. Harkin brought his bull over, and it married our cow. It was good to know that Bossy was going to have a calf, but all I could do was worry that a twister would carry off the new calf and kill it. I just kept doing my best. I told myself that I was a hero, and Mr. and Mrs. Harkin knew it. But the things I had lived through at 7 was nothing compared to what I had to live through at 8. Being a hero meant nothing changed. Well, my cheeks got all sore and chapped from the tears that wouldn't stop, but that was the only change. We hadn't caught the big fish. Ma and Pa still hadn't come home. May came and went, and June was almost over when we got a visitor. Mr. Meanie Mustache and his chicken wife came to see me. They pulled up in the middle of our nothing and stopped their wagon. I was just coming out the root cellar when they showed up. Since I didn't like him, I stayed in the darkness of the cave. He stood in his wagon seat and looked around. Then he got down and started searching out my footprints. I knew Pa admired his tracking abilities, so I walked out and stood where he could see me. He was a good tracker. Once he started looking, he'd find me for sure. Mr. Meanie's face lit up in a smile when he saw me. He ran around his wagon to his wife's side and gentle-like lifted her down. He helped her walk over to me. Solicitous. That was the word, solicitous. It had been one of Elmer's spelling words, but that was Mr. Meanie's behavior toward his wife. Very considerate. I started liking him just a little bit at that moment. Tears ran down her face. I wondered what all she had lost. Me and Elmer had lost just about everything but each other. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice scratched like cat claws on a rough tree bark. "Thank you so much." Mr. Meany smiled, but he choked and coughed, and he told me thank you too. What for? About then, Elmer came racing up to us. "What's amiss?" Mr. Meany shook his head and cleared his throat several times before he answered. "Nothing's wrong, young Calhoun. Nothing's wrong at all. The missus just wanted to come out here and thank your sister." Mr. Meany held out his arm, and his chicken wife leaned hard against him. She whispered something to him, and he picked her up and carried her to the wagon and laid her down in the back of it on a little pallet he had made for her. Then he came back to us. "Thank you." He held out his hand to me, like man to man, and I shook his hand, but I still didn't know what they came out here to thank me for. I shrugged my shoulders. Somehow, I didn't know how to tell him I didn't know what I'd done. I couldn't figure out what to say or how to make my throat work. It was all too much. Fresh tears just ran down my face. I started to walk off to get more grass. Mr. Meany grabbed me, and he gave me a huge hug. He looped one arm around Elmer and hugged him too. We finally got wiggled loose from him. "Why are you here?" Elmer found the words, even if I couldn't. "You don't know?" Elmer and I didn't even look at each other. I could see our heads, shadows, making the same motion on the dirt. "You found her. You found my wife." Mr. Meany dropped to one knee in front of us. "You found Ruth Ann. You found her." I guess he could tell we thought he was crazy. He tried again. "You stayed with her, and your brother and Mr. Harkin took her to Doc Fishface." My hand flew up and scratched my head. My mouth fell open, but no words came out. That mostly dead thing we found after the twister had been his chicken wife? It was more than my heart could handle. I tried to remember if I had said anything mean to her while she was almost dead. I didn't remember saying anything, but what if I complained about having to stay there with the nearly dead body while Elmer was off running around all over the countryside? Mr. Meany Mustache gave me another hug. While he was squeezing all the air out of me, he boasted, "When you run for mayor, I'm going to make sure everyone I know votes for you." He gave me one last squeeze and let me go. As he was jumping into his wagon, I swear he wiped a tear off of his face. As they disappeared over the hill, Elmer whistled low. "Think about it, Pinks. That dirty, not dead person was Mrs. Ruth. Ma's friend, Ruth Ann. That's when I got it. The storm had stolen her. She must have been a lot tougher than she looked when they came out for the fish supper. She'd lived through being attacked by that wicked storm and for days afterwards. We lost everything but each other. For a while, I lost me. Mr. Meany was so glad to have Ruth Ann back. He had come all the way out to our farm to thank us. That night, I slept without crying. It was a nice change. Chapter 18. The stack of lumber that was supposed to be a house sat in the middle of our dirt. No grass grew in the space where our barn and chicken house and cabin used to be, except a few weeds grew up around where the edge of our porch used to be. And a few sprouts of honeysuckle grew around the outhouse hole. I made a calendar and I marked off the days that Ma and Pa stayed missing. On what I believed was August 1st, I told Elmer we had to do some serious fishing. We'd managed to grow enough vegetables to keep ourselves fed. I remembered seeing those first sprouts from the seeds I planted. It felt better than flying off that rope into the river. Mrs. Harkin helped me preserve everything we didn't eat. Standing over that fire would have been miserable, even in the winter. But in the heat of the summertime, it was nearly unbearable. Mrs. Harkin and I even canned our extra fish, since Elmer hadn't even dug the smoking soddy yet. One day, I was ready for a change. Don't swim alone. Pa's words bounced around inside my brain like grasshoppers in a whiskey bottle. But I didn't listen. I planned it for days. I figured out how much rope I was going to need, and most important, I figured out how much time I was going to need. I had to get to the river before Elmer could get there carrying Annie. You couldn't leave that baby anywhere. She nearly fell in the outhouse hole and then the well. Elmer and Mr. Harkin built a circle of rocks around the well and had to put some special mud between the rocks. They stacked those rocks as high as Elmer's belt. They made a little pointy roof for it and a real building for the outhouse. They made a lock for the door so that she couldn't let herself in. That baby climbed on every rock and log she found. Once I found her sleeping on top of Bacon Boy. He was snoring like he had got into the sour mash. Bacon Boy was huge. I don't know if we ever had a Bacon Boy who had gotten so big. If I'd had a pig saddle, I could have ridden him into town. Annie and I rode him around in the yard. We tied a rope around his neck to help us stay on. We didn't get to choose where we went. Bacon Boy went wherever he wanted. His back was as tall as my shoulders. Buddy and I headed to the river before sunrise. Fatty almost never came home. She liked the river and she stayed there. Buddy started coming home sometimes. Maybe it was because the black pig that was his paw was a mean old thing. I almost felt bad for Elmer. He had to stay and watch Annie and milk Bossy at the same time. I almost felt bad for Elmer. I had to do it every day. He needed to see how it felt to take care of someone who needed constant watching. Never swim alone, I said out loud. Accepting my bad decision, I nodded my head. With one end of the rope clamped between my teeth, I monkeyed up the tree. I tied that rope off tight. I searched the river for turtles. I didn't want to hit one. I swung down and out and up, and it terrified me. Last year, I had been fearless. This year, I almost wet myself. Then I let go of the rope and dove down, down, down. I saw like a dozen good-sized fish, but nothing scary. I swam back to the top and headed downriver to climb out. But that twister and the flood had left debris behind. Some half-dead trees had hung up, not in the river, but not out of the river either. I'd barely gone 20 strokes when I realized I could climb out on those dead trees without swimming half a mile downstream. I raced back to the tree and swung from the rope again. That time I flew. I went as deep as I could. No monsters released themselves from the muck and the goo. Most of the muck had washed downstream in the flood. I rolled onto my back and just kind of glided toward the surface. I liked the way the sun shining on the ripples made funny shadows on my skin. I looked like I had big fish scales. I looked up to see how high the sun was, and between me and the sun, I saw a man shape floating down the river. I nearly sucked in air. If I hadn't been holding my breath on purpose, I would have. Still, it worried me. Why was he here? Who was he? Had he seen me? I wondered if he was swimming alone or if he'd had friends. He didn't move. He just let the river carry him. I swam closer to him, and a little closer, and a little closer, and suddenly I was too close. Rufus Gates stared at me with his one good eye open wide. But he didn't see me. He couldn't see anything. He was dead. I knew he was dead because of all the blood leaking out of his chest. Except dead men don't bleed. He had to be alive. I didn't want him to be alive. I floated up closer to him, and I waved my hand in front of his one good eye. It was open, but he didn't blink. I thought dead people always closed their eyes. I touched the scar I'd made in his eyebrow. He didn't blink, but I knew better than to trust him. I swam to the surface and watched him while I breathed. I sucked in huge, deep breaths and held him each for a few seconds, and then I sucked in another deep breath. I stayed close to him. I prayed he wouldn't breathe. I ducked back under him so I could see again if he was dead. A little turtle swam between us and took a bite of his bloody shirt. I could have held 3 or 4 turtles that size in my hands. He wasn't even bigger than a silver dollar. I shivered. I wanted to throw up. I thought I hated Rufus. I didn't hate him enough to enjoy watching him get eaten. I held my breath until 522. I didn't know I could hold it that long, but 487 came and went, and I didn't breathe. I just watched Rufus floating down the river. I don't know how long I'd have held my breath, but a big turtle came and took a bite out of his chest. I didn't want the turtles to get confused and nibble me. I wanted him to be dead for a long time, and now he was, and I didn't like it. If he was dead, how was he going to tell us where Ma was? I swam to the shore and climbed out of the river faster than anyone ever did before. I raced back to my clothes. I didn't bother putting on my dress. I jammed my feet in my boots and ran for the cabin. When I got close, I realized our cabin was still gone, and Pa and Ma were still gone. Elmer was here, but he'd only be mad that I left him to do the chores that he decided were mine. I threw my dress over my head and buttoned it up. I got it crooked, so I had to start over. Twice. The problem was a missing button. If it had buttoned up the front instead of up the back, I would have noticed it sooner. I ran into the root cellar and found Elmer. He was changing Annie's diaper. The whole cave smelled awful. I wondered if it was because of the greens I let her eat yesterday. I didn't mention it to Elmer in case it was my fault. It smelled oh so bad. Elmer said one of the words that Mr. Gates says to make people suck in air all of a sudden. Tisk, tisk, I told him. It's only a little bit baby poop. A body would think you never had to change a diaper before. Here, do this. It's your job. I made a sound that would have gotten me sent to bed without supper if I made it to Pa or to Ma. No, doing the chores you don't like isn't my job. I've never seen him so angry. Taking care of kids is women's work. His face had turned red in the morning light. This is your responsibility. I shouldn't even have to know it happens. I wasn't having it. Elmer, I found another body. Most likely this one's dead. He was leaking blood, and dead men aren't supposed to bleed. Maybe he's dead by now. Maybe he drowned. Get that baby dressed and come along as quick as you can. Meet me at Sheriff Bustos' office. I walked off and left the two of them in the root cellar. Elmer comes storming out with a smear of baby poop down his cheek and the whole front of his shirt contaminated with her mess. Pinky! He bellowed my name. I turned and walked back to him. When I saw why he'd hollered, I giggled. I shouldn't have, and I knew it. I just couldn't help it. Next time, maybe you'll learn to stand clear. By the by, I'm not washing that out of your shirt just 'cause you were careless." He pulled his shirt off over his head. I don't know how he kept from getting more of that stuff on his face, but he did. He wadded up his shirt and threw it at me. "Yes, you will wash my shirt. Laundry is women's work." I dodged his nasty shirt. I wanted to throw it back at him, but I didn't want to throw it badly enough to touch it. I couldn't tell that he'd ever try to keep his clothes clean. I'd done way more than my share of the chores. "Well, I don't need you then. I can work in the garden. I keep the weeds out of it. I had it planted. I milk the cow. I take care of the baby. I don't see that you're doing anything except running to town every few days to spend more of my hearts. You bought a house, but you haven't even gotten around to gathering up foundation stones. By now, you should have something built. You've done nothing that I can tell." I stomped my foot at him. "I'm going to town. And what's more, I'm going to tell Sheriff Bustos who I found dead and where I found him." He started for me, and I knew he was going to smack me. I bent over to grab a handful of dust to throw in his eyes, and my hand closed over a rock. He's right. I have a great arm. I threw one rock that killed a buzzard, and I put a scar in the middle of Rufus Gates's one big bushy eyebrow when I was 6. Elmer ducked, but that rock caught him where his head and his face came together. Blood ran down his forehead and dripped off his nose. We stared at each other while the blood ran down his face and onto his chest. Some of the blood dripped onto the ground, but most of it ended up soaking into his pants. He'd always been lean, but now he was skinny. Every rib showed. Suddenly, all the food I'd been growing and canning didn't look like it was going to be enough to get us through the winter. My heart wouldn't listen to reason or excuses. We needed meat, and he hadn't brought any home. "Don't you touch me, Elmer Calhoun. I'm doing my best. You're doing nothing but spending money and making sure I do all the work." By the way he coughed and choked, he must have been breathing in when my handful of rock and dust hit him in the face. His eyes watered bad, and it made mud trails down both cheeks. He held his hand to his head, but blood oozed between his fingers. He plopped onto his hind end on the ground. I walked to the well and got him a bucket of water to wash off. When I took it to him, I picked up his shirt and found a clean sleeve. "Here, wash your face." He didn't take his shirt. He just sat there shaking. For a minute, I thought he'd gotten so angry that he couldn't move. It took me a while to realize he was crying. I'd never seen him cry before. "I'm trying, Pinky." He choked out the words between silent sobbing. "I've gone hunting for Pa and Ma nearly every day. I catch myself climbing high into the trees so I can see further. I look for our folks all the time. I'm so mad at them. If just one of them would come home, we could make it. We can make it, Pinky, if we just had one of them." I looked at what had become of our farm. The green rows in the garden promised that we wouldn't starve this winter. Bossy stayed close. We'd have another calf by this time next year. We had 2 pigs. Most important, we had each other. Look around you. We are making it without either one of them. I don't like it, but we are. By the time we have to quit milking Bossy so she can have her baby, Annie will be eating more food. Give me another heart. I need to run to town to get a stove. It's going to get cold any day now. That made my chest burn hotter. He didn't want to do any work. He only wanted to run away from the farm. Running away had never been an option. I breathed deep a couple of times, but all it did was make me madder. I screamed at him, "No, you don't get to buy a stove until you've got a pile of wood to burn in it." That twister left hundreds of trees on the ground. Chop 'em up. I said the bad word that Pa never says. Elmer and I were both shocked into silence. I have felt that word bubbling up inside me a couple of times, but I didn't know it was going to come out of my mouth. Finally, Elmer said, "I hope you don't say that word where other people can hear you. You will never get elected mayor if you keep talking like that." Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being with us on that little adventure. One more adventure with Pinky. And the Pinkies and the Pinkies and the Pinkies. Yeah, that was kind of weird watching those chickens. But I could not watch. That was the weird part. I couldn't not watch the chickens eat those little pinky mice. I couldn't look away. That's bizarre, but I couldn't. Anyway, true story. And aren't you glad I didn't film that for you? Thought about it. I thought about it. But the chickens would have had the pinkies all ate up before I could have gotten in the house and got the camera and gotten you back out there. So aren't you glad? Aren't you grateful you didn't watch that? I wish I hadn't. So thank you for coming along on this adventure. Remember, we love you and Jesus loves you more. Mwah. Y'all have a blessed day.